Prince. Prince is a third-year student, Morehouse man. I forgot to write on the little sheet. Army veteran.
Navy veteran.
Navy veteran.
Yes. The real one.
And he has, what's that?
The real one.
I have learned from him about the way in which partition rules and other rules sort of affect Black communities that have suffered Black land loss. He's excited for this opportunity to share with you some of his own background and ways in which it intersects with yeah? Okay, good. All right, so please welcome Prince.
I'll click. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. I am A. Prince Albert III, and Professor Munchie has again given me the distinct honor of presenting to you a niche area of law, culture, and critical race study that is near and dear to my heart. My law school mission statement has been that I came to law school to acquire the skills and the network to lend societal agency to myself and my communities. This mission transcends any and every area of law. Day to day, I work in the technology and telecommunications sectors. In the academy, I study both white collar and indigent criminal defense mostly. But today, I will talk to you about property rights. I am Gullah Geechee. My father's family is from the southernmost sea island, the Amelia Island Inlands. I grew up in Philadelphia, but every summer and every major holiday for the first 18 years of my life, I went down to my grandparents on Amelia Island. I tanned to a color unrecognizable. I got nettles stuck in my feet and cactus needles through my shirt. It hurts, funny stories. And down home, I learned how to hunt, fish, crab, and live off the land as my ancestors had done for hundreds of years before me. I spoke and heard Gullah gossip, bedtime stories, wives' tales. The culture you saw in the Vice news video, that's my culture. Today, I'll begin with a few questions from the video before pivoting to the relevant property law concepts, and then I'm going to open the floor up to a policy discussion. I want you guys to help me think through what are ways we can preserve my community. So, who are the actors in the film and what are their roles? And I asked Professor Munchie to assign this particular documentary because it is a great visualization of the culture. You know, many people don't know this culture even exists. It exists among normal African-American Southern culture, but it is yet apart from that. And so I'm going to show you kind of who participates in the legal issues surrounding Black land ownership in the South through the video. So I'll give you a cheat sheet, but don't worry. Queen Quet is the woman that you saw, Marquetta Goodwine from Hilton Head, South Carolina. She is the chiefess of the Gullah Geechee Nation and founder of the Gullah Geechee Sea Island Coalition. Willie Hayward, attorney at Ayers Property Law Center, LLC in Charleston, North Carolina, that has dedicated his life and his law degree to preserving the property of heirs in the South. Adolph Brown, the real estate broker from Hilton Head Island. More about him in a minute. Lawrence Palmer, the Phillips community resident, landowner. He in particular is interesting because he talks about the oral wills from family meetings, right? Something we're going to talk about again, these agreements that were not formalized with any legal system, right? But are nonetheless very real to him and people in his communities. You have Greg Grant, a community activist, and the folkloric performances from the Geechee Gullah Darien Shouters and the final unnamed performer. Now, Willie Hayward and Adolph Brown in particular are interesting because they show a tension among members of the Gullah diaspora, right? People who have left the South and moved to the North for opportunity, come back to the South, and what do they come for, right? The Gullah Geechee kind of see, will people leave us, become educated in the North, come back to the South and use their powers and education for good or evil, right? And Willie Hayward seems to generally symbolize the good, and Adolph Brown, to cut my words short, is not so good. So when and how did the Gullah acquire land? Land was often purchased during the Civil War and the Reconstruction era, so soon after the Civil War. It was given by white former plantation owners who fled the South for the industrial North. They saw the end of slavery as the end of their wealth, so they sought opportunities northward, gave their land away, sold it for cheap prices, or they died without children. And there are a lot of untold stories about the very familial bonds between slave masters and slaves, such that slave masters would give their land to their slaves in the absence of them having their own heirs or children. And so land was passed down nonetheless through generations of heirs, mostly without legal instruments, right? So here we have the Ark Land Code kind of problem emerging in a Gullah Geechee context. You have primary and secondary heirs, right? Grandparents, parents, children, right? That would be a vertical passage of land ownership. But that's not really how Gullah Geechee life lives, right? Many cousins, siblings live all together, grow up all together. So land can be passed not just vertically, but horizontally, right? To cousins, nephews, nieces, second cousins, third cousins. Some people don't even know quite their relations to each other because they've just grown up together all their lives. And you also see, with the lack of legal instruments, a mistrust and an exclusion from national legal systems, the national legal system, state legal system, municipal legal participation, etc. So I also want to highlight here there is an organic dispute resolution mechanism in Gullah Geechee communities that is not often recognized. Family meetings are very, very common where witnessing takes place. Witnessing both referring to the oral testimony given and oral testimony heard of people that kind of state what should be done with the property, what should be done with the land. Everyone witnesses what is heard, and the matriarch or patriarch makes the final verdict of what they want to be done upon their death, right? And so the oral wills that Lawrence Palmer from the Vice News video talked about are very, very common. So what are the legal ways that the Gullah Geechee people are divested of land? Number one, I would say, is tax hiking, because it is the largest in scope, right? Tax hiking is the intentional, excessive, and unjustifiable elevation of taxes, often related to gentrification, right? So this is a way that a legislature can make a decision about raising taxes in a certain area and target Gullah Geechee communities in that area, right? Partitioning, as we talked about, which we'll talk more about that later. Eminent domain, which I'm not sure if you guys have talked about yet.
Not yet.
We'll do, okay. Eminent domain is one way, and adverse possession is another way. Occupying land owned by someone else with the intention of claiming it as your own. And these are legal ways. One can question kind of some of the ethics about those ways, but definitely these are legal ways that the Gullah Geechee are divested of land. And how big is the problem of black land loss in the South? Huge. I would say it is systematic. The ProPublica article highlights a few things. Here's some excerpts here. Not having a legal will jeopardizes land ownership. The U.S. Department of Agriculture calls the lack of will the leading reason for involuntary land loss in the United States among black families. Families must make themselves perceptible to and accountable for land in the legal system. Rights begin with recognition, right? So what is the scale of the heirs property predicament? Today, heirs property accounts for 2.5 million acres of land in the South that equal roughly $28 billion value. That's just what's left. From 1910 to 1997, African Americans lost 90% of their familial farmland. And I really want to leave this impression that the divestment and dispossession is in fact systemic and intentional. Courts with ulterior motives has facilitated systematic divestment by agreeing to partition agreements and adverse possession agreements. And seeing many of these pop up in a jurisdiction over time leads to a systematic result of divesting certain people in a certain place of all the land they own, right? States and federal agencies have also facilitated strategic divestment by denying public and private financing or disaster relief. And this is executive agency mismanagement, right? Denying public funds and disaster relief. Municipalities and states believe that their land is in their jurisdiction is best utilized by large-scale, profit-generating corporate activities instead of hosting Gullah Geechee communities. And after courts and local legislatures have denied access to resources, hungry corporations lay in wait for the imminent failure of Gullah Geechee land ownership. Failure like failure to pay taxes, divisive partitioning, eminent domain, adverse possession, or even tortious nuisance. What legal remedies are available? One is the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act, the UPHPA. The Uniform Law Commission, established in 1892, provides states with nonpartisan, well-conceived, drafted legislation that brings clarity and stability to areas of state statutory law. The Uniform Law Commission proposed this UPHPA first in 2010. And the model legislation helps preserve family wealth passed to the next generation in the form of real property. So as we've learned, the default rule is that a landowner who dies intestate without a will, the real estate then passes to the landowner's heirs as tenants in common under state law. And too often, tenants in common are vulnerable because any one individual tenant can force partition, right? Cases you've seen. And too often, real estate speculators acquire the smallest share of heirs' property or can acquire an entire parcel for a price well below its fair market value, and is a way of systematically depleting families' inherited wealth in the process. The provision provides due process protections like notice, fair appraisal, and other things that kind of stop in the way of direct partitioning and kind of create stopgaps in the beginning to kind of stop the end of partition or complete divestment. I had a hypo, but I'm going to skip it for the sake of time. So I now want to get to the policy discussion, right? Us as policymakers, how can we balance Gullah Geechee participation in modern legal system and the preservation of the Gullah Geechee people, right? Participation versus preservation. What are some areas of the law that can do justice in this space, imagining new law? Or what existing laws, civil rights laws, general property doctrines that can apply to help these people save their land? Should federal law step in to help assuage systemic loss, right? This raises federalism issues for a state common law issue. Or should states have the autonomy to implement local solutions in local ways? And can municipalities be trusted to really do that work? So I want to open up the floor to some of your thoughts.
May I ask you to say a little bit more about the methods to inform heirs property map, right? So I just want to make sure we all are kind of clear. The reason why it's so easy to sort of dispossess large communities is because of the partition. Once the rules of intestate succession create humongous classes of tenants, right? And like you said, it just takes one to sort of force a sale. So these communities are vulnerable to things invest in this way. So I guess I'd like you to say a little bit more about how the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act, how good of a job it does in protections.
So, rereading the Arkland Co. case, right? One of the things is, first, we want to provide notice, maybe we think if all the heirs, wherever they are, knew that the land was in jeopardy, right? Knew that there was default on taxes, knew that there's a possibility of a usurp in ownership, right? Maybe they would band together and stop it from happening, right? Convince the one party that, hey, there's value in us keeping this familial land, don't do it, right? And in so many instances, one person who has perhaps remained, while many family members have left, want to sell the land to get their piece or want to take it all and assume direct ownership. And so one of the principal ways and the first outlined way in the Uniform Act is providing notice to every heir imaginable possible, right? Which takes some genealogy work in many cases. Another thing is fair appraisal, right? Oftentimes, vulnerable families who are really, really needing money, and I highlight tax hiking because probably I would say the number one reason why land is lost is not that families don't want to keep it, it's that they can't afford to keep it. They don't make enough money. Even all of them put together don't make enough money to pay the excessive, ever-increasing property taxes. And they default after a certain time and it goes up for sale. And so appraising the property at a fair price, at least in the event of sale, provides the full fair market value to these people. You can't just prey on vulnerable families in their times of need. They'll take any amount, oftentimes unresearched, right, at the true accretion of value of land over time. It provides partition options. So, right, the Arkland case, the first prong of the test is whether property is conveniently divisible. And if it is, great. And part of my hypo was 10 family members, 10 heirs, 10 acres of property. It's just a square in a field, nothing unique about any piece. Clip one piece, sell it, sell that guy out, right? 9 people now own the 9 remaining parcels, right? That can also be a way of coming up with tax, right, money. Selling a parcel at a time, but I know from experience and research, right, that begins, then every year taxes come up. It begins slicing off parts of the land until nothing's left, right? So these are some of the ways that, and a court also supervises sales to make sure that the commercial party, perhaps interested in a property, does so in a fair way with a fair appraisal and notice prongs. And so this is it adds extra due process protections for the family. It can't stop forced sales, but it can create a few more stopgaps to say, hey, before we just okay this sale on a rainy Friday evening at the courthouse, let's really do our due diligence and see if there's a better way.
Other thoughts then? Other kinds of directions, right, to the law?
Yes.
I thought about property tax cap. Like if you set a property tax cap, and some states do this already at 2% or 3%, just to provide stability and predictability, and it would be somewhat insulated from spikes in demand. So people would just know that's going to increase like 2% every year or something like that.
Similar to that, I think Baltimore recently was struggling with the problem of urban gentrification and established a system where new sort of companies and wealthier individuals that were coming in were priced at the new property price, and established families, often minority families, their taxes were not increasing. They were actually often given profits taken from the taxes of the very wealthy people who came in to sort of help them maintain their ability to live in such a higher cost of living area. So I mean, that's not a property law solution so much as it is a municipality taxing law solution.
So, just like how class actions someone's required that a certain threshold will be met of the affected class in order to settle or just make any kind of crime action in the class. Instead of just being one person on could be like 65% of the people who have mentioned that land decide want to do something.
So you mentioned the possibility of using existing civil rights law to kind of tack some push out process. So like, for example, when the state levies or the municipality levies unreasonable taxes on the community, but doesn't follow through on actually providing the same level of municipal services to these communities that they would to other members of that municipality as a whole. Going after those policies and seeking injunctive relief to try and end them because they're not actually delivering what they're promising and having a disparate impact is something that is a fascinating way of approaching the issue, whether it's complicated, but yeah.
Yes.
You mentioned, when I watched the video, the real estate guy stuck out to me about, it needs to advance and keep up with progress and so on. I'm just curious, what would your rejoinder be to that perspective?
Adolph Brown is his name. Adolph represents, and I don't want to bully him, right? He represents a group of people that Gullah Geechee culture is very, very communal, right? I don't see anyone standing with, Rudolph. I don't see anyone, he's not arguing or working in anyone's interest but his own. And the end result, if we take his approach to the entire eastern seaboard of Gullah country and the Gullah corridor, is that everyone should just sell their land and disappear, right? Disappear into the population. Just get over it. Someone has a better use than you. Take your money and dip, right? And what's next what's left for the next generation, right? And so, it's funny because we were just talking about, commercial properties in the Heartland Co. and like, how do we value things? And I think a fundamental question is, are Gullah Geechee communities valuable today, right? Do these people and their way of life, does it matter? Does it have a commercial interest? In some ways, there are people who have commercialized the Gullah Geechee land tours in South Carolina, right? In ways that they have integrated themselves into the economy. Some of those were family decisions, right? To open up property and, Civil War sites and things like that families live on to others. Some of them are kind of forced. One family member, like an Adolph Brown, didn't go the extent of selling and making it a golf course, but kind of kicked everybody else off the property, built a bed and breakfast, and like, we're gonna do this. I'm getting a commercial license. And family members are at loss of whether they have interest, whether they should be getting proceeds, what are their legal remedies for correcting this. If they didn't want this done, do they sue each other, do they not? And so the lack of consensus in Gullah communities kind of plunges the community into pandemonium. And he used a very troubling example of Manhattan Island, right? He's like, what would it be like for Indians to just live in the middle of Manhattan Island today? But what if we could have made space, right, for coexistence? What if we could imagine something, a Manhattan, that we couldn't imagine today? And we have that opportunity to reimagine what coexistence looks like in the South with $28 million, dollars of 2.5 million existing acres today. It doesn't have to all disappear and it be lost in a law lesson forever.
I'm curious if this has been considered. I don't know exactly what the process would be, but like community land trusts or something to get used. Is that a process that, can it be converted to a land trust, or is that not doable just because of the way it's held?
It can be, and this is one of the solutions, right, to the issue. The problem is buy-in, right? You're dealing with people that have been on the edges of the justice system for centuries, right? And so, it would take a massive education endeavor from a neutral party, someone that the Gullah Geechee people trust, right? And Queen Quet has been very instrumental in trying to evangelize the idea of trust, right? Getting families to invest in another legal instrument, not just defaulting to whatever the state has. Because the state default law was not made with these properties in mind, right? This is just kind of jimmied in back door as to what the problem is, but it's really a unique situation, and that's a unique solution.
How does that even work when you have such broad ownership? What would it take you? Would you literally have to contact every single descendant to every area?
Probably. It's in a lot of these. There are other really cool videos I can share. People that just specialize in genealogy studies. There's a woman, a Vice News documentary about a woman that goes state to state to just help people identify who heirs could possibly be, and kind of contacting everyone, whether it could be an email, phone. They may never come back down to the South, but if they can provide some kind of testimony to the court saying whatever the family wants, I want to trust, or something with a substantive notice and their agreement to something, it can work, no matter how many years. I don't think it's impossible. Yes.
Two thoughts for all of you. So one thing that I learned this time that I didn't learn before, right? There's a familiar narrative that a lot of Black communities haven't taken advantage of securing their interests by wills because of lack of knowledge or lack of trust.
Right.
Right? But what you also just told us is that there is in place a system
Yes.
of passing on land with intention.
Yes.
Right? And it just happens to be an oral tradition, which is not recognized by our legal system. So there's a part of what we can identify as a problem of also like the withholding of recognition, the legal withholding of recognition of a set of intentions that are well worked out. So that's one thought. The other thought, again, trying to sort of return us to some of the doctrine that we've looked at. What the case book offers proposed the idea of new tenancy for cohabitants, something like that, right? Imagining that sort of better can be captured, those of us who aren't married, sort of rearrangement, like marriage. But what if we imagine another kind of tenancy by the entirety, right? So kind of indestructible, but harder to sort of sever, kind of co-tenancy that better recognize the collective personal interests of people over and against like individual interests and somebody that is standoff fellow, right? We have some rules that require some degree of unanimity or some degree of consensus among those co-tenants.
And on your first thought, I actually thought about social media and technology, right? I wonder what if families recorded meetings and kind of they kept doing it the way they always wanted to do it, right? But did it in a way that was preserved, recorded. You could see that there's no duress, right? There's no, that this is agreed upon by everyone, a vote in the room as they normally go. And I think just preserving that with technology and presenting that right in a place and confronting people that want to partition 10 years down the line. On camera, you told grandma you would never, right? And believe it or not, it's that kind of living document, if you will, that we can keep the legal resolution of these issues out of the way of partition and out of the courts. So on that note, I'll leave you with a parting thought. On January 12th, 1865, Union Army General William T. Sherman met with 20 Black ministers in Savannah, Georgia, and asked them what they needed after the war to survive. One of the ministers, Reverend Garrison Frazier, answered General Sherman, freedom. Freedom is placing us where we can reap the fruit of our own labor. Thank you, Professor Munchie, for that.